It's very common in translation industry. We don't have domain-specific translation memories to fine-tune a generic machine translation system.
Continue to use AI to improve content production efficiency and promote the industrialization of the online video industry.
Highlighting the kind of crossover or why exactly language service providers might be interested in virtual data room space.
And welcome everyone to SlatorPod episode 130. Hello there, Esther.
Hey Florian, how you doing?
I'm okay. Today we have a very interesting guest, Yasmin Moslem, machine translation researcher at the Adapt Center in Dublin. And we're going to talk about a really, really interesting topic. They published a paper on it, like basically using AI to generate reference text to train machine translation in domain. So niche domain, lack of reference text, generate a ton of reference, like custom reference text, and then training the MT with it. Seems like a big deal to me. That's why I want to have Yasmin on the podcast. She could tell us a lot more about that, and excited to talk to her. Before that, we're going to be talking a little bit about machine dubbing in real life. So we found a real-life example of application for machine dubbing. Then you're going to tell us a bit more about TransPerfect's recent acquisition, or most recent acquisition. And we're going to talk about transcription and captioning, which is something that's popping up more and more on our radar, and we cover quite actively now, because it's also kind of converging with the broader translation localization industry as we see it with media localization. You know, we spoke about it a couple of times when we published our video localization report. It's an interesting space.
Well, I'm from the tech side as well, I think, right? With sort of transcription coming first in a lot of the workflows.
Correct. So, but first, let's talk about iQIYI. I don't know what tone it is in Chinese, but iQIYI. So they're using, it's a streamer, it's a Chinese streamer, and they're using machine dubbing as told by the CEO, Yu Gong. So they had an analyst call, which we dug out from the filings. And so iQIYI said that there are, and let me quote now. First, they said tech is fundamental to support our development. We continue to use AI to improve content production efficiency and promote the industrialization of the online video industry. And then they're saying that their proprietary AI dubbing technology has now been deployed in the first quarter of 2022, and it's widely used in their film offerings. Now, we did dug deep, and we did take out subscriptions and looked at a lot of the shows. Now, we didn't find that it was widely used in their film offerings. I think we found a couple of Thai dramas that were dubbed into Vietnamese using machine dubbing. So I couldn't judge the quality because, you know, my Vietnamese is kind of rusty. Vietnamese is like one of the hardest languages to learn, like for, I guess, a Westerner along, like maybe Cantonese. It's just super hard. So they said they're using, so iQIYI said that they're using the dubbing in their overseas business. For example, now I'm quoting the CEO, when we launched a few films in Thailand using iQIYI dubbing that received a very strong user feedback and generated strong revenue performance. So he says that AI dubbing is effective in optimizing costs, yeah, of course, and driving revenues for, in their words, long tail content.
So not the sort of premium stuff.
I did watch like 15 minutes of the Thai drama. It's like, yeah, it's not premium content.
Is it like soap operas?
Yeah, soap operas, completely, like, you know, like fancy cars, and then like, you know, beautiful people in fancy cars and things like that. So yeah. Now I don't want to make this a huge deal, but I think it is a big-ish deal that there is now machine dubbing being used in live settings and like in real life settings. Yes, it's, you know, what they say is long tail content, but still, I mean, they went ahead and approved it, and they're seeing apparently, even if you strip out all of the kind of PR speak, there is apparently optimization of costs, and they're seeing, you know, revenues going up, because if people can access it, that, I mean, if you're in Vietnam and you don't speak Thai, which I would assume 99.9% of Vietnamese wouldn't speak Thai, so they can at least watch this, and it might not be great, but at least you can kind of follow what's going on the screen. So interesting development, and you know, I'm curious to see how this is going to develop going forward. Probably Asia will be one of the early adopters. I mean, is already an early adopter, and this is going to likely blaze the trail here.
Do you think machine dubbing for the long tail content will eventually sort of help to be able to do AI or machine dubbing for more premium content, or content higher up the food chain? Just because of having sort of the practice and training content, potentially.
I think I doubt it in the next decade. I just wonder how the translation, I mean, it's the raw, even the translation quality, the cultural appropriateness of, you know, that.
But like with some kind of post-edit after, or...
And maybe some light post-edit or something, or some post-edit. But yeah, I mean, but you're not going to pour, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars into content, and then like you're running some like $20 like AI dubbing thing on top of that. I doubt, for like a major show. So yeah, it's probably going to just be as an additional option to make it more accessible to people that know this is not dubbed by professionals.
Yeah, but still want to watch it for whatever reason.
Yeah, and it's, you know, maybe in markets where people are not used to subtitles, or not super fast readers in general, etc. I don't see this breaking through anytime soon in like very mature markets for premium content. But you know, no, actually, I don't think I'm wrong. I think I'm right here for the next couple of years, 4 or 5 years. All right, let's do a full 180 and head to your beautiful town of London, where TransPerfect acquired a virtual data room company called Sterling. Tell us more.
Yeah, so this is news out this week from TransPerfect, based in the US, that acquired a London, UK-based virtual data room technology company, or VDR technology company, called Sterling Technology. It was a competitive bidding process, so TransPerfect had been invited to participate, and the company was, you know, looking to find a buyer. And Phil Shaw told us, the TransPerfect CEO, told us that this is one step in their goal of kind of proactively addressing the VDR market. I mean, they do already have solutions for VDR. I think they've got proprietary technology called Transcend, and did another acquisition in the space back in, I think, more than a decade or 15 years ago now. But I think what's interesting in this acquisition is just sort of is highlighting the kind of crossover, or why exactly language service providers might be interested in virtual data room space, which is not necessarily a natural area of expansion, you would think, for language services. But actually, when you start digging into it, there has been a really long history of language service providers with relationships to virtual data rooms, and particularly in the world of kind of legal and financial printing. So you have, I think we even did a story back in sort of 2016, kind of highlighting the potential demand and opportunity to be found in that space. So you have, you know, companies like Topan Digital, you know, the language service provider. Their sort of, I suppose, sister company, Topan Merrill, has a whole host of VDR solutions as part of their financial legal printing. And then, you know, back in the day, you had Donnelly, that was also owned by a financial printer that also had VDR solutions. I think at some point, CLS and Lionbridge had some kind of partnership with VDR solutions. I mean, the logic here really is that your clients and LSPs clients might well be using VDR solutions a lot. So you've got, you know, in the advisory, finance and legal space, so the most common users of VDR for things like corporate transactions, which obviously require this super secure room, or super secure sort of environment to collaborate, to exchange documentation and comments on things like deal-making processes. But also, you know, wider fields like in the corporate space, life sciences, real estate. And if you think about it, you know, a lot of deals that happen, if you think about even this acquisition, it happened across a border, you know, albeit two countries, US and UK, speaking roughly the same language. But in other situations, when you're, when you're conducting M&A or going through that process of bidding for a company, you might be having to deal with people on the other side of the world who don't necessarily speak your language. But yeah, just to finish off, I mean, it's not a huge acquisition in sort of probably monetary terms, in the sense of revenues likely being under around 12 million US dollars. That's just based on UK regulatory filings. And then also, yeah, Phil Shaw was saying it's actually a potential game changer in terms of them sort of stepping up and proactively addressing the VDR market. So yeah, watch this space.
Yeah, there's a lot of companies there like Deal Room, Firm Room, Intralinks. That's one of the really old incumbents. I remember when we looked at the space, Intralinks was kind of the number one. And then, yeah, 4Data, Merrill has something. I mean, the problem, you alluded to it, is like that they're trying to solve with this is if you do a merger, an acquisition, right? You need to share, if it's a large acquisition, you need to share, gigabytes of data in a secure way with potentially multiple parties if you go into some type of auction-like process. So even if it's just a normal, exclusive transaction with a buyer, lots and lots of data. You can't email that stuff. You can't just open a Google Drive or, something like that. So these data rooms have like super granular access. In a sense, you can regulate access super granular. You can say, okay, the CFO can look at this set of data. The CEO can look at that data set of data. The investment banker can see that you can like watermark certain files. And again, where translation comes in is if you do a cross-border deal, let's say in Japan, China, Indonesia, whatever, Germany, there's lots of files that may need to get translated. And then, you want to be at the source. And that's what TransPerfect obviously found out like 15, 20 years ago when they were really aggressively going into this legal kind of corporate M&A market. So why not own the technology outright? At the time, back that was 12 years ago, we partnered up with a company, a VDR provider.
We being CLS.
Sorry, we. Yeah, at the time, CLS, right? With a VDR provider, and it did result in a few deals. I mean, so it was worth it, right? And so we funneled some business to them, they funneled some business to us, but obviously we never owned the actual VDR. Cool, VDR it is. Over to another kind of adjacent industry that we now more regularly cover is transcription, captioning. There's two companies that are actually listed on the stock exchange. One is called VIQ, Vic. And the other one we've talked a couple of times now on the pod is AI Media, based in Australia. So VIQ is based in Toronto and listed on that stock market. Quite sizable. Kind of the companies are somewhat comparable in terms of their revenue. So like a half year for Vic is like 24 million US. And so yeah, that's what, like roughly 50 million a year, and AI Media revenues are like 60 million Aussie dollars. So actually they're almost the same size. And Vic kind of narrowed their loss. They're generating losses, but they're narrowing the losses.
Okay, that's somewhat good. Yeah.
Somewhat good. Same kind of for AI Media. They also published their full year figures. And they actually published an annual report with a lot of kind of, information about the industry in there. And let me just check the figures here. So they grew 22% to 60 million Aussie dollars, which I don't know, what is it, roughly 50 million US maybe at the current exchange, or maybe a little less. They improved EBITDA from like minus, again, EBIT is like earnings before interest, blah, 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 from minus 8.7 million to now plus 1.1 million. So turning an EBITDA profit, that's good after like years of losses. Good top line growth, but losing ever more money. Now they're kind of, the picture has flipped. They are generating 55% gross margin. And in terms of the booking numbers, let me see, the number of minutes, I think they have something like 21 million minutes that they delivered through one of their solutions. It's like we talk about words, they talk about minutes. 21 million minutes. That sounds like a lot of. Sounds like a long time.
Sounds like a long time, a lot of minutes.
Sounds like a long time, a lot of minutes. So throw another solution. So they have 3 solutions. One is called Lexi, which is automated, so kind of like MT in a sense, just drawing the analogy here. The other one is Smart Lexi, which is like a post-edited version of transcription. And then is AI Premium, which is this human, has 99.9 accuracy. It's kind of a service margin, and it's their most expensive product. And the other 2 are like more SaaS, software as a service type of business profile and margins profile, and obviously you want to go there because that's higher profit margins, etc. Also, they did like an interesting competitor analysis. So they reviewed Verbit, which we talked a lot, like a unicorn, right? Valued at over $1 billion in their most recent funding round. Redbee, 3Play Media, Rev.com, which also has gotten a ton of funding. A company called Enco, which I'm not familiar with, and Everts has a kind of 80s style looking logo, so maybe not the most I don't know, recent funded startup or something. Not sure what the analogy could be. So yeah, so these companies, they didn't list VIC, which is interesting. And just to round off, in terms of the share price, because both companies are publicly listed, look it up. Since I think it's like mid 2020 when AI Media IPO'd, like both companies are down. The stock's down like roughly 75%. So quite the downhill trajectory for both, with VIX having spiked like 150% and peaked like in, I think, early 2021, and now just like lost a lot. So it looks like that bubble has deflated quite dramatically. And but now, in terms of the business results, both companies are actually on more solid footing, starting to turn a profit. And we're certainly going to investigate this topic, this area a little bit more. We should probably have a transcription captioning experts on the podcast in the next few weeks. So we'll put that on the agenda. But first, we're going to talk to Yasmin Moslem about a super interesting idea in terms of how to train machine translation. And welcome back, everybody, to SlatorPod. So today we're really happy to have Yasmin Moslem on the podcast. So Yasmin is a machine translation researcher at the Adapt Center, where she's working towards her PhD. Hi, Yasmin.
Hi, Florian.
So where does this podcast find you today? What country, what city?
I study, as you said, PhD at Dublin City University. So I'm in Dublin, Ireland.
Nice, Dublin, Ireland. Great city to be. Was there like at a Lock World about 4 or 5 years ago and haven't been back since. So I need to really go back. One of the centers of localization, of course, right?
Of course, yeah.
Today, we're going to talk about using those new powerful language models to generate reference text to train machine translation, because you and a group of fellow researchers recently published a super interesting research paper titled Domain-Specific Text Generation for Machine Translation. But I need to cliffhanger there. Before we dive into this very interesting but complex topic, tell us a bit more about your kind of academic and professional background and your career to date, because you have a long background in the translation localization industry. So tell us more about that and how you came to where you are now doing a PhD in Dublin.
Yeah, I guess my story overlapped with the stories of many linguists and translators. I'm someone that loves language, and I studied English literature, and then find that translation is something very interesting. And I find that this is how I wanted to continue my professional career and life. So obviously, this comes with opportunities and challenges. But eventually, I ended up working as a freelance translator and in-house translator for several companies. As you can imagine, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, the idea of computer-aided translation tools, etc., this was like something new, a little bit new. It was not required as today by every freelance translator, but it was mainly adopted in big companies. So the idea here is that at some point in some project, I found that using these tools, they helped me, and then it allowed me to apply to certain type of big companies. Like I have this skill, so I can apply to these companies, and these companies, as you can imagine, would provide better settings, like a better rate, a better deadlines, etc. So here it was a technical skill that helped me at the point. So I started joining fellow translators. This is something good, and maybe we all should improve our skills in this area. And um, this is when I started to feel like. Okay, I want to learn more about this, and maybe I became like more. I had more experience in this than maybe the average. At some point, there was like a mutual interest in me joining WordFast LLC. These were 7 great years I spent at WordFast, helping translators, project managers, and localization engineers. And maybe you will say, okay, what is the relation of machine translation with this? When machine translation started, etc. At some point, I consulted for a company, a language service provider, in the area of translation, translation technology in general, and they had previous research in the area of machine translation. So they said, we want to try this. At this point, it was like, okay, well, there are still big players in the area. Why we should have this as a language service provider? And they said, we wanted to try to and see what if we use our own translation memories, because we believe that, yes, there are big players that have good machine translation, but if we use our own our own translation memories, we might have better quality for certain clients we have. So okay, let's try this, and it was just like an experiment. But interestingly, it gave good results, because now you have something like domain-specific or client-specific machine translation. So you are training your system on something that is relevant to the source text that you are going to later translate. So machine translation started to provide relevant translations. So this was and it started with me trying to build rather than to use machine translation, because of course machine translation has been there for several years for users. This was in 2014. And yeah, after this, I started consulting for a few companies in this area of machine translation, and started to try to expand my knowledge in the technical aspects, like natural language processing, deep learning, etc. And I had the opportunity to join the PhD program at Dublin City University, which was, and it is a good opportunity to also expand my research skill in this area.
Fantastic. So really the trajectory from translator, so, know the language, like a very deep language background, to like in a business context, and now you're doing the research. So that's a great set of qualifications to doing what we're doing now. And so give us the super simple kind of overview of that paper you published, domain specific text generation for machine translation, and like what was the idea and the goal, and just kind of the outline for our listeners to understand this a little bit better before we go into some of the details.
As many workers in the translation industry understand that machine translation systems usually depend on having translation memories or bilingual text, parallel text, translated originally by humans, by human translators, and we use these translation memories, large amounts of them, and of course the quality must be good. We use these to train a machine translation system, because at the end of the day, current approaches depends on statistics and probability. So they need to see something and a large amount of data to be able to make the relations and eventually be able to hopefully translate texts in the same language in similar domains with a good quality. So this is originally how any machine translation system work, and usually maybe you have a baseline or a generic model like this. But then when you come to domain-specific machine translation, what we usually do is that we get, for example, specialized translation memories and start to fine-tune or adapt the original generic baseline on these specialized translation memories. The problem that we deal with here, and it's very common in translation industry, is when we don't have domain-specific translation memories to fine-tune a generic system, a generic machine translation system. So, and this usually happens, for example, if you get a very big project for a new client or something, but of course you can't share the translation memories from other clients because this will be because intellectual property, etc. So now you don't have uh, enough data to fine tune or adapt your baseline model. So this is the problem. Of course, there are different research works in this area. What we tried to offer in our paper is that first we use large language models to sort of generate domain-specific text. And the idea here now is that I think maybe the majority of translators and workers in translation industry heard of large language models, but if they didn't, it's basically another machine system, automatic system that can generate text. For example, you give them a sentence and these or a partial sentence, and they started to complete the story. They basically will build on what you have said. I went to the doctor at a certain street. The machine will start saying, for example, the street was busy or crowded. The doctor told me so and so. Of course, this is an imaginary story, but at the end of the day, it's similar to what you have just said. So this is what language models specifically, because there are different types of language models, specifically models like GPT and Bloom that can generate continuous text. So we use this to generate domain-specific text based on maybe you have a very tiny translation memory, but not enough to fine-tune or adapt your system. And this is, of course, in the target language, because here the flow of language will be seems like it's written by a human, regardless, maybe the information is not accurate, but at the end of the day, you will notice that it's linguistically good, depending, of course, on the quality of the language model. After this, now we have the target text, maybe a huge amount, as much as we need to train a domain-specific machine translation system. We need, of course, the source side. So we use back translation with another machine translation model in the other direction to generate the source text. So both here, the source side and the target side are synthetic data, and this target side is generated by language model, and this source side is generated by back translation in the other language direction. And we start using this synthetic or artificial new domain-specific data set to fine-tune our baseline machine translation system So, uh, interestingly, the results are very good, very promising, and it seems like this approach works. Of course, it is due to the fact that you have a good quality language model, you have a good quality machine translation system. So now we are reaching the point that sensitive data generated by these systems can be used as uh, um, a method for data augmentation, especially when you don't have enough data.
Now, would this have been possible, let's say 2 or maybe 3 years ago? Or is this really kind of built on these large language models that we've heard so much about kind of in the last 12 to 18 months?
As you said, yeah, this is quality of these models is very important because, yeah, at the end of the day, if if you have a language model that generates bad text, notice you will put the text on the target. So this is the outcome that you need to have. So we need to have a high quality. Of course, large language models started maybe a couple of years before this. Of course, there were other language models, but not with the same scale. This is important. Yes, as you said, this is a huge improvement that allows us to investigate new areas maybe that weren't possible a couple of years ago.
And how are you ensuring that the output is somewhat custom, right? You mentioned the example like, okay, I'm walking to the doctor and I'm on the street. So would you prompt it like with some really obscure kind of in the main prompt, like, I don't know, like in a life sciences context, like a very obscure jargon filled prompt, and then it would take it from there? Or how does that work?
Okay, here we are investigating the two use cases. The first use case is that you have a very tiny translation memory in the domain. So you use the sentences of the target sentences of this small machine translation memory to generate more sentences. So you take only one sentence, like a sentence by sentence from your this tiny translation memory, and for each sentence, the large language model will continue the story and generate a couple of more sentences. Of course, you will split them and create your um, larger translation memory. This idea here, with each sentence here, and for example, we used TAKO19. It's a public health translation memory. TAKO19 was talking about COVID-19 and some pieces of advice about how to avoid it, what to do, what kind of these medical or health related details. So yeah, when you take a sentence in the medical domain, it will continue more about this, and that's why it's important here when you use large language models, because they are trained on the internet and several ideas and several articles on the internet. Yeah, so this is the first scenario. The second scenario is if you don't have a translation memory at all and you don't want to invest in creating a small translation memory or something, and now you have the source text of your project, and you want to translate this source, and this source text is, let's say, it's in the medical domain or financial domain, it's in in certain domain. So you can take a portion of your source text and forward translate it with any machine translation model you have, your baseline, and obviously, hopefully, it's um, uh, a good model. So it's the translation will not be perfect, but it will still have some characteristics of the domain, and then you use this portion to apply the same idea by generating more data with the language model. Of course, the first use case will give you better results when you have a small uh, static translation memory and you started to generate more data on it. But still, the other approach will work if you don't want to invest at all in creating a small transition.
How much synthetic text are you generating? Or have you for this particular project? And then, like, does it matter if it's, I don't know, a megabyte, a gigabyte, a terabyte, or like for the outcome and the quality?
Okay, this is an important question because maybe you would say that if we already have a tiny translation memory, why don't we fine tune the system or directly on this tiny translation memory? The thing is, when you fine tune baseline, you have a large baseline machine translation system or model, and you want to fine tune it, you need enough data for this. You can't just have of course, there are research about fine tuning in tiny translation memories, but the best results will happen when you have, for example, quarter. When you have, for example, quarter thousand sentences, like um, 200,000 or 300,000, and you start fine tuning your baseline machine translation system on them.
But when you're actually generating this synthetic text, like, not like, how much does it matter how much you generate? Because you mentioned in the paper, like, you can essentially generate unlimited amounts.
You can generate unlimited text, but in here and we generated like something like a quarter million, like so 200,000 or 300,000, something in this range. And we applied mixed fine tuning, which means we extracted a portion of the original generic data set, like for example 10 times or 9 times this domain specific, and we applied some sort of mixing in weights to make them like similar, like taking, for example, 9 sentences from the small in domain and 1 sentence from the generic data set. So to make them like virtually equal. They aren't equal, but with weights, with having a higher weight for the smaller data set, and make this mix, you will get a baseline, you will get a domain specific, a fine-tuned model for your domain. Yeah.
Just to geek out on this a little bit. So, but would it matter if you did 10x or 100x more than those 250, like with 2.5 million or 25 million? Would that have an influence on the quality, or you think at some point you just hit diminishing returns and it doesn't really matter anymore?
This is an important question, and there are, of course, here some criteria regarding also efficiency, because sometimes when this is a quality that you need, you just stop here because you don't want to use extra resources. But I saw some colleagues who started already applying this approach, and they said, okay, fine, we will use more than this. And of course, when you use more than this, you can achieve better quality, but at some point you wouldn't really need too much data. So maybe something like 500,000, maybe something like maybe maximum million. I wouldn't really apply because there's another point here. Your generic data set. This also depends on the diversity of generic data set, because here we are maybe talking about the scale of language service providers. But if we go for a larger scale, like for example big tech companies, maybe they will have different like bigger generic data sets, and hence they can of course use bigger in-domain data sets. Depends on the settings, but generally speaking, in the settings that we usually apply in a language service provider, I would say that starting from 250,000 to something like million in domain dataset is just enough. As I said, of course, to make the process as efficient as possible.
Yeah, you're right. I remember from my LSP days, like when it hits 500,000, 700,000, it starts to become really heavy, and like there's a lot of like not great data in it anymore. So this seems to be like a natural kind of threshold, maybe 500,000. So typically when we look at all these machine translation research papers, they're more geared, it seems, towards like solving relatively niche research problems or like super broad things. But this, what you're presenting is, to me, it seems extremely applicable to the day-to-day operation of a translation company, of an LSP. Did you choose and lead this project because of your background in the industry, or like how did this come about, the interest?
First of all, it's important to highlight that research papers, as you can imagine, depend on each other. So, yeah, yeah, I understand. Of course, as you said, there are multiple directions, like multiple types of in general research papers, whether they are about architecture, hardware, data, ethics. Process efficiency. At the end of the day, um, you need all this to complete the process, the final process. And we have like something like 7 pages of references. We will be able to make our paper and experiments and conduct our experiments without depending on this. But I understand your point. Of course, the research papers is also a type of content, and just as any type of content, they have different types of audience, right? So yes, there are of course some papers that tend to be more applicable in certain directions. Like you take this paper and apply, for example, as a language service provider. Um, yes, of course, there is this kind of paper. Obviously, they depend on previous research. Um, of course, yes. My background, of course, maybe have or definitely have influence on my selections, because also I have still contacts in the translation industry. I hear. I listen to their problems. I try to figure out solutions, maybe something that will end up in a new approach. Or I recommend something different. So yeah, definitely, of course, my background in the translation industry influence my research decisions as well.
Let's stay on this kind of real life angle here. So do you see this getting, in a sense, implemented or productized relatively quickly, or do you feel there's a lot more things that are missing currently? Or like, let's say I'm running a $10 million revenue language service provider. Should I like, send you an email and like make sure that I can get this in production as soon as possible? Or how far is it from like, again, being deployed like in day to day?
There are two aspects here. The first aspect is that, yeah, of course, this can be applied, and there are already some colleagues in language service providers who started applying this approach and sending me, as you said, sending me an email asking the questions, and of course, fine tuning or adjusting the process, because of course you might have slightly different use cases and start experimenting with different things and asking the questions, making sure that it fits well. They already got very interesting results. Some of them not only apply it when they don't have any machine translation memory, any translation memory, or any or a small one, but they already tried to say, okay, fine, I have a translation memory and I will fine tune on it, but can I make it even a little bit bigger with sensitive data? So mix this with this, and they already also managed to get good results. So yes, this approach is applicable, and you can also adapt it a little bit based on your use cases. Of course, here we have like high level use cases, but maybe your exact use cases will be a little bit different. And this is one thing. Yeah, it can be applied directly, and it's already applied. This is something make me happy, of course. The other, yeah, the other aspect is, should every, because this is some importance, should every language service provider go now and build a machine translation memory in a machine translation system in general, or not? This is important aspect I'd like to mention. Of course, not every language service provider should do this themselves, because nowadays this is completely different than, for example, um, 20 years ago. Nowadays there are at least 100 companies that offer machine translation services, and they expect, for example, language service providers to maybe invest in this. So maybe this is a good option for some language service providers, right? And maybe other language service providers would see, no, for some reason, for whatever reason, logistic reason, financial reason, no, they wanted to invest in their own machine translation systems. So maybe the second point is a little bit not a direct answer to your question, but it's worth mentioning that we aren't saying that every language service provider should adopt whatever approach is offered by the research, and they must apply this themselves. No, they must, of course, investigate the options that we have nowadays and try to find the best thing to their own company.
Yeah, but it could also be a feature, right? For these, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 kind of standalone machine translation companies, they could, instead of like maybe, I mean, you can already do like custom terminology, etc. But if there's like a feature like, hey, domain training, and you can just drop a few prompts and then, whoa, quality goes up. I'm sure it's not easy to build, but it's maybe something they should consider. Because I agree with you, not every LSP needs to build their own proprietary machine translation system. That's probably too much R&D for a service company.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, this could be a feature, because let's agree that data is money, and we have limited data compared to the huge amount of technology or that we have nowadays. We still have limited data, and data is very just as hardware. Yes, we have expensive hardware and expensive data, and these are maybe the two main factors nowadays that we need to solve in the area of machine translation research. So moving one step towards solving the idea of limited data is something good, definitely. Yeah.
Now, maybe I'm not sure if it's controversial in research, but like your paper cites BLEU, that quality metric, which we like even 5 years ago wrote a piece at Slator.com about like that it's becoming not obsolete, but like that it's basically quite contentious. Like, what's your general take on BLEU and its relevance today, and maybe like in 5 years from now when things have gotten even better?
In our paper, we used 4 automatic metrics apart from human evaluation. We used BLEU, we used car F or character F plus plus. We used two. We used also Comet. These four automatic metrics they are different in how we handle this. And the first three are still depending on a similar approach, except that one depends on character, which is character F++, and one depends on words, which is 2. But Comet also depends on a different concept, which is semantic evaluation, which means we don't here count how much the reference is similar based on the exact word or the exact character, but also the meaning. Maybe the translation, of course, translation can use different words, different order as well. So here, Comet uses semantic evaluation. The meaning, if the meaning is a little bit similar, it will be able to say, okay, still the translation is good. The majority of research nowadays in creating a new machine translation evaluation metrics move in this direction, and we don't need more very exact evaluation. We rather need more semantic metrics. why do we still use BLEU? It's because we need, of course, to compare our results with other papers, because as you can imagine, advancement in machine translation is very, very fast. So actually, the papers that we compare our approach to, maybe it will be just a couple of years ago. We can't discard this completely. Until the moment, companies, academia use BLEU. So we still use BLEU, but nowadays, even in if you have a reviewer for your paper, they will tell you, no, BLEU is not enough. You can't just publish a paper with BLEU. You have to add other metrics, because this will make sure that your results are valid. Also, and most importantly, human evaluation. We apply the human evaluation because this is, at the end of the day, language is about words and about how it's perceived. So human evaluation shows you some interesting results. Sometimes they correlate with your automatic evaluation metrics. Sometimes they say, no, actually, multiple translations can be okay, especially in languages. Here we are talking, for example, about the medical domain. So everyone most likely writes in English and translates to other languages. So it's very common to find multiple terms in Arabic or Spanish for the same term in English. So if you apply something like BLEU, this will not take as a correct translation, but human evaluation might say that this is okay. So basically, to answer your question, we have to continue using BLEU for some time to be able to compare our results, but we have to integrate our metrics as well, other metrics as well, whether they are semantic, automatic metrics, and of course, human evaluation.
Got it. So to round off, like, what's your advice for anybody listening here who's in a, core kind of linguistic career, translation, reviewer, etc., and maybe will be interested in exploring a more technical role, right? What you're doing now.
Basically, it's important to understand that all of us understand that whether you start from a linguistic background, a business background, a technical background like software, or mathematical background, at the end of the day, machine translation is an interdisciplinary field. It's an interdisciplinary area, which means you have to get a little bit from each field or discipline. So basically, based on how much you get deeper in certain discipline, and the final, how you mix these components together, and this will end up whether you work on machine translation business, machine translation evaluation, machine translation, the technical part of machine translation. And when you ask about the technicality of machine translation, okay, this is something also. Again, it's not like everyone should go and do exactly this, right? Okay, so there are different rules in machine translation, because this is important. Some people would say, I don't know how to write code, for example, so I can't work in. No, maybe you like marketing, maybe you like evaluation, maybe you like something linguistic. Now, rules in machine translation and in deep learning in general aren't well defined, but there are like an endless of rules in the area. When it comes to technicality, maybe concentrating on aspects like, for example, Python programming. This is now the language, the programming of every natural language processing when you start, at least. Also, later you can have other programming languages, but the Python programming is important. Looking into very important libraries about natural language processing, NLTK, this kind of stuff. Understanding that spiral learning is important. Spiral learning is important. So it's not like stop and you have to finalize this. No, move and try to improve as you go, because as you mentioned, we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Maybe we will have another technology that improves things and it changes things. Um, Another thing that I highly recommend, which is paper reading, join some groups that read papers, read recent papers. Maybe this is something that is underestimated, but it's important. And it's not really, we don't really have to understand every paper, no, but just getting some concept from each paper. And as I'm saying, it's a spiral learning process. Joining some group that reads papers, recent papers, and popular papers. I highly recommend anyone who wants to get into the area of machine translation, regardless of which role they wanted to have, to join some reading group. This will be very useful.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. That was super interesting, and I hope people go and download the paper. It's free. So thanks again for taking the time today.
Thank you very much, Florian, for your time today. And yeah, this was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Yeah.